Hey everybody, this is Grandmaster Ben Finegold with our weekly class. This class is sponsored by Griffin. Thank you, Griffin. If you want to sponsor a class, contact my wife, Karen. Her email is karen@hlchessclub.com. And tonight's lecture is on the closed Sicilian, extensively from the white side. So I went to the Wikipedia article on the Sicilian, and the first several paragraphs are about the open Sicilian. Then they get to the closed Sicilian. You can ignore this top diagram, that's for the previous thing. The second diagram is the main line, that's actually what we're going to look at today. Closed Sicilian, white fianchettos the king bishop and doesn't play d4. As long as white does all that stuff, it's usually a closed Sicilian. Then they talk about the closed Sicilian a little bit, but not very much. However, they claim the second most common move after e4, c5 is knight c3. I'm not sure if knight c3 is more popular than c3, but maybe it is. You know, who am I to question Wikipedia? Okay, and the sponsor, Griffin, he wanted me to show at least one Spassky game because the world's best player in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s who was playing the closed Sicilian often was Boris Spassky, and he was the world chess champion. And then probably in the 90s and 2000s, the most famous grandmaster who was playing the closed Sicilian with white was Nigel Short, and we have a Nigel game also. Now the closed Sicilian begins with knight c3, and in the closed Sicilian, white is not interested in playing d4. And in fact, Bent Larsen, famous grandmaster in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, he wasn't a fan of white playing d4 in the Sicilian. He said you shouldn't trade a center pawn on the d line for a side pawn on the c file. So Larsen thought Sicilian was good for black, the open Sicilian. And one thing that's not the closed Sicilian, but it looks like it, and it could transpose, is after black makes some move, let's say knight c6, white could also play bishop b5 or f4. Grandmasters also play those moves, but I wouldn't call that a closed Sicilian. The only way f4 would be a closed Sicilian is if white later played g3 and bishop g2. So typically the closed Sicilian starts in this position after g3. So white isn't going to open the center with d4. That's why it's called the closed Sicilian, and white fianchettos his bishop. Typically, the ideas for both sides, white usually attacks on the center and the king side, and black attacks on the queen side. And the difference between the way Spassky played white and most club players play white, most club players know you're supposed to attack, so they spend all their energy attacking. And Spassky would many times try to thwart his opponent's queenside play. So often white's playing f4 and g4 and f5 and g5, and black is playing b5, b4, knight d4, and playing on the queen side. A lot of times, Spassky would stop his kingside attack and stop black's counterplay on the queen side. And you'll see some interesting games. Spassky has white in this game against Vlastimil Hort. Hort was one of the top 10 players in the world in the early to mid 70s. And this game was played in 1978. Players had about the same rating. And if you buy my course on the Sicilian on Chessable, which came out 3 months ago, I recommend the move e6. One of the reasons I recommend it is it's not very common. And then black tries to play d5. Okay, but most people play g6, including me. I've played g6 most of my life. And when I was a kid, I often played the closed Sicilian with white. As an adult, mainly with black. And you get this position. And black has three different ideas he can play regarding these three pieces, the two pawns and the knight. He can play e6, knight e7, and d6. He can play d6 and knight f6, or he can play d6, e5, and knight e7. And a lot of times, players with black play d6, e6, knight e7. That's pretty common. And one of the negatives of black playing e5 is we're giving away the d5 square. If you play e6, white can't play knight d5. And we're going to see examples where black plays e5 and white plays knight d5 and has a nice knight on d5. Okay, so d6, then f4 is the most common move. And then black played e5, which doesn't really have a great reputation now. And Spassky played an unusual move. Spassky was known to like to play knight e2 in the closed Sicilian, and here he played knight h3. And there's a grandmaster most of you haven't heard of, and his name is Alex Strapunsky. He's an American grandmaster. He's played in a few US championships. He's probably in his late 40s now, at least. So he doesn't play a lot of chess. He does a lot of coaching. And Strapunsky always plays knight h3 when he plays the closed Sicilian. And that's sort of a rare idea. But what white wants to do is when white castles, he wants to play f5, and his rook is defending the f5 pawn. And if black ever takes on f4, white wants to take with the knight, and the two knights control d5. One of those knights is going to go to d5. And occasionally, the knight will drop back to f2, and white can try to play g4 and f5 and so forth. So knight h3 is interesting. In most closed Sicilians, you're going to see white play knight f3. Okay, so Hort developed his knight, white castled, and Hort played knight d4. This is a typical move in closed Sicilian. Black likes to play knight d4. Sometimes white retreats his knight either to e2 or d1, depending on the position, and plays c3 and kicks out the knight. Otherwise, knight's pretty good on d4. Okay, f5, Spassky sacrifices a pawn, and white's threatening f6, which wins a piece. So black takes. A pawn is a pawn. Black has lots of pieces defending the pawn. The dogs don't like it, but what are you going to do? Okay, so white played queen h5, and he's hoping Hort gets greedy and takes this pawn, which is silly, and then queen takes f7, check wins. We fork the king and bishop and so forth. So obviously black's not going to do that. And he played h6, which stops my bishop from going to g5, and it stops my knight from going to g5, which is a good square for both of those pieces. Rook f2, that defends the pawn on c2, and it prepares for white to double rooks on the f-file. Okay, and Hort decided castling kingside looks a little dangerous. If you castle kingside, white plays bishop takes h6. So he decided to castle queenside. Bishop e3, queen d7, doubles rooks, and castles queenside. So black is a pawn up, and black ran his king to the queenside. If you look at 100 closed Sicilian games, maybe in 2 or 3 black castles queenside. It's extremely rare. But Spassky got his attack going on the king side quickly, so Hort got out of there and castled queenside. Okay, knight d5. And this is actually very funny. I haven't seen this very often. If you take the knight, your bishop on e6 is trapped. Usually bishop on e6 isn't trapped, but it is here. So you can't play knight takes. So he played f takes e4. Now black is 2 pawns up. Knight takes e7 check. Queen takes e7. And Spassky played the brilliant bishop takes d4 and rook takes f7. And I think the point of bishop takes d4 is he doesn't want black to throw in knight f3 check at some point. So he gets rid of the knight. And if black captures the rook, and we capture, we have a fork. And if black pins the rook to the queen, then queen g4 check, and we're attacking the bishop twice, and it's defended 0 times. 0 times is not enough defense for your bishop. So he didn't do that. He played queen e8 right away, and now the rook is pinned. If white moves rook, then queen takes queen. So white played bishop takes e4 and said, I'll sacrifice the exchange. I'm not sure if he said that. Also, white's threatening bishop takes b7 check here. And Spassky figures my bishop is great and this bishop on g7 is no good, and I'm going to attack the black king. So he played rook f8 because the rook is pinned, so he attacked it again. Bishop f5, a brilliant move, and probably Hort didn't see that because that's a shocking move, undefending your rook. And if you play rook takes f7, which he didn't do, we check and we take, and material's even, but white's knight is going to head to e4, and black's bishop is just stuck back there. So this is better pawn structure for white also. Black has 3 pawn islands. Okay, so he took with the queen, then we take the queen, and you can't take with the bishop because it's illegal. Although that would be the best move if it was legal. So he takes back, takes check. He doesn't want to lose his rook for nothing, because then he'd be a piece down. So he plays rook d7. Spassky pins with rook f7. This threatens to take the bishop, and they traded all the rooks. And this position, white has a clear advantage because white has a 2-to-1 pawn majority, and black's bishop can't really get active. So they move their kings up. And here, black should play king f6 and try to stop white from moving his king up. But he played d5, which is a mistake. And white moved his king up, and probably Hort thought, yay, I get counterplay in the center. I'll play e4 and I'll get a passed pawn. And unfortunately, he didn't get a lot of counterplay in the center, and white just pushed his king side at majority. b3 is a very good move. That forces all of black's pawns on dark squares, so the bishop can never get active. And now white has passed pawn on the king side. And in this position, black made his last mistake, but he's losing anyway. He played bishop g7, and white just pushes the pawn in. So that was silly. And white wins a piece, so black resigned. So a lot of Spassky's wins in the close Sicilian are, he won because he's Spassky. He outplays his opponent, he gets a winning position, and eventually he wins. And most people who play the close Sicilian at the club level, they like to checkmate their opponent. They like to push all their kingside pawns and play for an attack. And actually, that's what Spassky did this game, but he was playing Hort, who's one of the top 10 or 15 players in the world, so he's harder to checkmate. He castled queenside, and he still got punished on the king side, and eventually he got to a worse ending. And as you may have noticed, this bishop was always bad. It was always blocked by all of his pawns. Okay, and I have another Spassky game, because, why not? And this game is against Jan Timman, who for probably 25 years was the best player in the Netherlands. And a lot of people thought Timman was the best player in the West for a long time. That's the best non-Soviet player. They thought it was Timman. And Timman was top 10 in the world for quite a long time. This game was played in 1982. That's probably like the height of Timman's powers in the 80s. Okay, so they played a close Sicilian, because that's what this lecture is about. Got to the same position, and white played f4. And in the previous game, Hort played the move e5, and Timman played e6, which I think is more common. And when I played black in a close Sicilian, I would play e6, knight e7, and knight d4. Okay, knight f3, knight g7, castles, castles. This is the main line. Bishop d2, that's sort of a Spassky specialty. And typically, grandmasters today play the move bishop e3. But Spassky played bishop d2. This prepares white can play queen c1 later and get a battery and defend the b pawn. White defends his knight in case the queenside pawns move to fight against black's queenside initiative. And Spassky didn't want his bishop on e3 because after knight d4, for example, then we can't take with the knight because we get forked. We're walking into a fork. And there's two things you have to do. Don't walk into a fork in chess, and in real life, don't walk into a fork. Terrible. Okay, so Spassky played bishop d2, unusual move. Rook b8, Timman wants to push his pawn, typical. a3, b5, rook b1. And the rook on b1 protects the pawn on b2, and it gets off this diagonal. So for example, if the game continued this way, knight e2, the bishop can't take the pawn for free because it's defended. And the rook's better on b1 so that the bishop can never get an attack on the rook either. Timman played bishop a6, developing his last piece. And Spassky played b4, which he can now play because his knight's defended. And he blocks the b pawn, so the bishop on a6 looks silly. The bishop on a6 can't get any action on that diagonal. And this is typical Spassky. He's meeting his opponent's queenside play by trying to stop it, and then he'll win on the kingside later. That's his idea. Queen b6. Now we're threatening discovered checks everywhere. So king h1, takes. Rook c8 on the half-open file. And Spassky plays knight e2. Spassky's ready to play d4 and build a big center. And again, this bishop on a6 looks pretty silly. d5, black plays in the center. Knight c1. Spassky eyes the c5 square. He wants to put his knight on c5. So he plays knight c1 to b3 to c5. That's his plan. Rook d8, queen e2. They traded. Knight d4, forcing more trades. Bishop e3. And Spassky played in the style of Yasser Seirawan by taking a pawn. That's a free pawn, why not take it? Now, of course, in this position, black doesn't have to lose the pawn. Black can play queen d7 defending, but then knight b3 to c5 is even stronger because that would fork the queen and the bishop. You can't really stop knight c5. That's a very nice square for the knight. So he decided to play queen c4. He didn't worry about his a-pawn too much. And Spassky's like, I'm a pawn up. What's the problem? And he played the rest of the game a pawn up. And eventually, black was able to win the pawn back, but at the cost of losing the game. In this position, he played the move h5. If he plays knight takes b4, his back rank isn't defended. Check. And you could play knight takes or bishop c5 first, and that's winning because the bishop on f8 is attacked. In this position, black played the move h5, so after a back rank check, he could play king h7. Bishop c5, bishop f8. And after e5, white has a nasty pin, and this pawn structure in the closed Sicilian is often very good for white. We get the connect 4 here, and we have the beautiful bishop. And you may have noticed this bishop on a6, after Timman played bishop a6, that bishop didn't move anywhere. Okay, we can't play knight takes b4 because our rook is attacked, and the knight can get pinned. I think after knight takes, rook b1 is the winning move. Okay, so he did play rook takes. Rook b1, this actually happened. Knight to d5, rook takes, bishop takes, king g1. There's no way to defend this pawn. So he's going to play bishop takes knight and take the c pawn, and that's what he did. And white's up a pawn, and the d pawn is weak. White's trying to win the d pawn. And his king just walks up and takes it. Knight f3. Knight e1, and you can't save your d pawn. So white's going to be 2 pawns up with extra pawns on both sides of the board. So Timman decided to resign. If you're playing in a club tournament or you're playing blitz chess on the internet, you would never, ever, ever resign here. But if both players are top 10 in the world and it's a slow game, black's often going to resign here because it's hopeless. Black will be down 2 pawns for nothing. So again, those games to me weren't the kind of games people who join a lecture on the close Sicilian want to see. They want to see white sacrifice all his pieces in checkmate. And I'm with you, when white plays the close Sicilian at the club level, we see a lot of kingside attack and black attacks on the queen side, and both people are successful, and then somebody wins. And since that's more interesting, the last 2 games are the more interesting type with attacking chess. And when you think interesting attacking chess, you think Richárd Rapport. And this game was played as a blitz game, but it was brutal. And this was in the World Blitz Championship in 2021 against a guy you never heard of, because if you'd heard of him, he wouldn't have lost so badly. His last name is Holm, Kristian Holm. 2464 is his FIDE rating. And it's nice to see mismatches and openings you like, because you get to see the correct ideas played for the side you want to play, and then you see how to beat the wrong ideas. What often happens, this happens to a lot of club players, you analyze an opening, and the opening you're analyzing, you're looking at the best moves. You have databases, you have engines, you have grandmaster games, and you see the way both players play. Then you play a club game, and you're playing a 1400, and on move 4, 5, and 6, they make moves you've never seen before. They don't play the grandmaster moves. Then you sit there confused, and then if you end up losing, you're like, that guy didn't know the opening, and I didn't know what he was doing, and complaining. Okay, but when much higher rated players like Rapport play lower players and they play the opening wrong, then you see it get punished. Then you're like, that's how I should have won. Okay, so close Sicilian. And this is the same in every game. And here black played rook b8. Black wants to play b5, b4. Richárd Rapport says, nope, you can't play b5, b4. Plays a4 and stops it. And black was quite insistent. So black played d6 and a6. He wants to play b5. And Rapport didn't play f4, knight f3. He played knight e2, which is another way of playing. Castles, b5. Typical close Sicilian. White's going to attack on the king side, and black's going to play on the queen side. Although now, white has the open a file for his rook. That's pretty good. f4, b4, knight to d5. Often we can't play knight to d5 because our opponent's already played e6. So in my opinion, in this position, black should probably play e6 and then play b4. Then white has to figure out what to do with his knight on c3. Is he going to go back to b1 and then d2? Or is he going to move his queen and play knight d1? I don't know. So I don't like the move b4 because we get to play knight d5. He kicks him out, and we play knight e3. And this is good for white's attacking potential. You don't often see a knight on e3 in the close Sicilian because often you see the bishop there. But now the bishop is protecting the b pawn, and the knight is really good on e3 in preparing g4 and f5 and getting a big attack. Knight e7 and f5. And again, just like in Spassky's game, the first game we looked at with Hort, white's threatening f6, which forks the bishop and the knight. So black has to stop that. Takes. White's threatening f6 again. So takes it, ruining his pawn structure. And white plays knight f4. So white's down a pawn, but it's a doubled isolated pawn. We have queen h5, we have knight h5, we have either knight to d5, our bishop is beautiful, our rook's on an open line. This is excellent compensation for white. Just the fact that he can play knight h5 later gives him enough play. Castles, knight h5, black saves his bishop, and then king h1, white gets off this diagonal, which is usually a good idea because queen b6 and bishop d4 sometime happen. And white could be thinking about playing rook g1 and g4 and trying to open the g file also. And king h1 sort of shows the helplessness of black's position. It's hard to suggest an idea for black. The queenside play isn't there because my knight is controlling c4 and we're controlling d5 and our pawns are back here, so black can't move any pawns forward. Knight d4, as is typical in the closed Sicilian, and rook a7. White's starting to attack from both wings of the board. The rook actually can't be touched on a7. You can't play rook b7, there's a bishop here, and you can't play queen b6 because the rook takes the knight. So black played knight c6 and said, get your rook out of there. Stop that. And then knight takes f5. This is the move that black missed. And obviously, if you're a student of mine, you shouldn't miss knight f5. And the knight on e7 was protecting the f5 pawn, and now it's not. And the idea is white wants to play queen g4, which leads to checkmate. So black doesn't have time to take this rook because queen g4 is just checkmate soon. Okay, black didn't want to get checkmated. Well, then he probably shouldn't have played knight c6. Okay, so he played knight takes f5, bishop takes c6. Now we have equal material, and white still has the ideas of queen g4 check. Queen b6, forking two of white's pieces, forgetting about his king, I guess. Queen g4 check. Now, if you play knight g7, white has a very interesting mate, which I'm sure you all see. Knight f6 checkmate. And that is a smothered mate. It's just a smothered mate you don't see very often. Black's pieces are trapping his own king. So black played the other legal move, bishop g7, and this is a very simple remove the defender. The knight is defending the bishop on g7, so the queen can't take because the knight takes, so we remove the knight. And even though black could throw in queen takes c6 check, we just play king g1, and there's no defense to queen takes g7 checkmate. Probably the engine move is like queen g2 check or queen h1 check so that it staves off mate. But obviously you can't stop queen g7 mate here. So instead of that, black just fell on his sword and just took and got mated. And that didn't take very long. White won that game very quickly. White played f4, f5, knight h5, queen g4, opened up the king side, and checkmated black. Black wouldn't have lost that badly if it wasn't a blitz game. But a lot of the top players in the world will play the closed Sicilian and blitz chess against weaker players because they don't see it very often. And the closed Sicilian is fine for white. It's just as good as the open Sicilian, but it's not very popular. People love playing white in open Sicilian. Closed Sicilian they don't like as much because they don't see the best players in the world playing it very often. You don't see white being Carlsen and Caruana and Nakamura. You don't see a lot of closed Sicilians. Usually, club players will do what the higher rated players do. They'll follow in their footsteps. And they won't play an opening unless everybody's playing it. It's not very popular now, but there's nothing wrong with it. And it's a really good weapon because your opponent doesn't face it too often. So if you're playing the closed Sicilian, you'll be playing closed Sicilians often, and your opponent will be facing them less often. Okay, and last but not least, but mainly least, we have a game with Nigel Short versus a Chinese grandmaster, Zhang. He's 25-67, and this was a rapid game played in Beijing. And Nigel was 27-01 at this point. This game was played 21 years ago, when Nigel was better than he is now. Probably in 2003, Nigel was very good, 2,700 FIDE. He wasn't the best he ever was. Probably he was the best in the mid-90s. But 2003 is still very good. Nigel likes to play the closed Sicilian also. So if you want to look at closed Sicilian games where white's always winning, you want to look at games with Spassky and Short, having the white pieces. Okay, now we see knight f6. We haven't seen that before. White can't play e5 because e5 pawn's hanging. If white could play e5, black wouldn't play knight f6. And in fact, I tell my students that's the case in all openings in chess. When black plays knight f6 in the opening, if white can successfully play e5, you probably shouldn't have played knight f6. Here we can't play e5, so he played f4. Now he can play e5, except it's not his turn. If it was his turn, he would play e5. Okay, so d6, you still can't play e5, it's not defended enough. Knight f3, and castles. And you could play e5 here, but it's lost some of its punch because the knight can just go back to d7. So he just castles. Rook b8, as usual, black wants to attack on the queen side. That hasn't been working out because I'm showing you games that white's winning. So these ideas never work for black. h3, Nigel wants to play g4, and if he plays bishop e3, he doesn't want to run into knight g4. So h3 has two ideas, prepares g4, stops knight g4, stops bishop g4. b5, that's why he played rook b8. g4, that's why he played h3. And c4. c4 is very unusual. The reason black does it is black has some pressure on the e4 pawn. So if black had his druthers, he would try to play b4. He's hoping that white takes so the e pawn isn't defended as much. But typically black plays b4 in the closed Sicilian, not c4. Although c4 is explosive. Okay, so c4 is an unusual idea. Nigel played bishop e3. And white's position looks really good. Look at this nice pawn structure here. It gets a lot of space into black's position, and black always has to watch out for g5 or f5. Bishop e7. He plays a3, making b4 not so strong. Takes, d5. Black doesn't want to sit and get attacked on the king side. Black attacks in the center immediately, trying to take advantage of his knight on f6 and his bishop on b7, putting pressure on e4. Nigel plays bishop f2 because d4 was going to win a piece. So he doesn't allow d4. And later the bishop can go to h4 if it wants and put some pressure here. But mainly we're just stopping d4 winning a piece. d4, knight e2. White has tremendous pressure on the d4 pawn. 3 pieces attacking d4. Knight e8, that defends the pawn on d4. Black is safe. Rook c1 on the open file. And black plays e5, which forces a decision in the center. Should white ignore e5? Should white take on e5? Or should white play f5? And the answer is none of the above. Okay, Nigel Short, as you know, has been on my stream. He visited Atlanta about 5 years ago. His daughter, I think, goes to Georgia Tech. And he gave a simul at our chess club. And we were on stream together. And he knows my stream sayings. Always play bishop f1, always play king b1, never play f3. And he knows one of my more important sayings, always sacrifice the exchange. And the knight on c6 was holding black center together. Now black center disappears. And white's going to get 2 pawns and passed pawns and crush the bishops for the exchange. And this is very strong. Knight takes e5. The d pawn is a goner. You can't save the d pawn. Although you do want to save your bishop. So he played bishop a8, took the pawn. Now white's threatening knight c6, forking the queen and rook. So he took. And white has 2 bishops, a big pawn center mass, and 2 pawns for the exchange. White has a crushing position. Knight c7, knight b3, getting out of the way of the d-pawn. Here comes the d-pawn. Bishop takes a7 like Spassky. There's a free pawn, he's going to take it. And then moves back. Now white has 3 pawns for the exchange. Knight c5. Now the bishop is attacking the rook and the b-pawn. So he takes. Just takes because his bishop is so good. Doesn't want to trade it for the rook or give black a passed pawn. d4. And white just has all these pawns that are moving up the board. And black's king isn't safe. I tell all of my students, if you ever play g6, you have to play bishop g7. I mean, black did play bishop g7, but now the bishop's gone. And white has a dark squared bishop and black doesn't. So that means the queen and bishop can come in here and threaten checkmate, sort of like Richárd Rapport did. And also white can try to get several queens in the center. And black has no pawns. Black's pawns from the E file to the A file are gone. So the extra exchange is meaningless, but all of white's extra pawns win the game for him. Rook b2, activating the rook. Queen f3, threatening queen takes f7 check. Queen c7. h4, he wants to play h5, h6, and queen f6, and mate on g7. A simple plan, but effective. Rook c2, bishop d6. The queen has to stay on the f-pawn. Queen a7, king h1. We can't play queen takes d4 because queen takes f7 check leads to a very quick checkmate. And it loses the rook. I like the way everybody plays king h1. In almost every game, if not every game, the king is safe on h1. On g1, it's on that open diagonal, which we see a lot. Rook eca, doubling rooks. d5, that's not a good bishop on a8. That's a bad bishop. Rook c3, queen f6. Okay, now white wants to play e6, and black thought he prevented e6 by playing the move queen d7. And then black realized, wait a minute, now e6 is even stronger. He thought if you play e6, the bishop is hanging because he was in time trouble. But after e6, if you take this, I take with check, and then I take your queen with check. And then I queen with check, and then the other queen checkmates you. This position is good for white. On the other hand, if you don't take the bishop, you lose even worse. If the queen moves somewhere else, taking here wins immediately, and bishop e5 wins immediately. I think this wins more immediately. Then you have to give your queen away, and you get mated and won. Not only do you get mated, but your king and rook are forked. Terrible. So after black played queen d7, black was like, wait a minute, e6 is the most crushing move of all time. And black resigned before Nigel could make a move. Typically, people don't make a move and then resign, but since Nigel can play e6 here, and even if Nigel doesn't play e6, he's winning. But since Nigel can play e6, he's like, whoa. So those were two Spassky games who played a lot of played a lot of close Sicilians in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that was him beating very strong players, Hort and Timman. And then I showed you games by more exciting players like Richárd Rapport and Short, who mercilessly attack their opponent's king and push pawns on the king's side and break through against, weaker grandmasters, 2,500, not 2,750 guys. Anyway, if you want to see more games in the close Sicilian, I recommend looking at Short and Spassky's games. Richárd Rapport plays it occasionally in Rapid. And there's a lot of Rapid and Blitz games that are published now, and you'll see more close Sicilians. It's unfortunate that the close Sicilian isn't in style. A lot of grandmasters aren't playing it now, but that's actually good for you. Okay, when I was getting better at chess and becoming a professional and improving my game, I liked when nobody played the openings I played because my opponents didn't prepare for those. So a lot of times on move 5 or 10, I have those positions all the time, and my opponent's never seen them before. So this is advantageous to the club player that there's not a million Grandmaster games in the closed Sicilian. When you play the closed Sicilian, you'll have the advantage that you play it a lot, and your opponent doesn't see it a lot. They have to prepare for open Sicilians and C3 Sicilians and F4, the Grand Prix attack, and also when their opponent doesn't play E4 and plays D4. So your opponent's not going to see the closed Sicilian very often, so if you play it with white, that's quite advantageous. If you want another line to play with black, I recommend, let's go back, see how fast the computer goes back. Pretty fast. I recommend black can also play E6 in this position, which is not super popular, and you're trying to play knight E7 and D5 or knight F6 and D5. And that gets you different kinds of positions where black is playing in the center more quickly, and often black plays bishop E7 in castles instead of bishop G7. But at the top level, G6 has always been the most popular move, and if you play white in a closed Sicilian, that's the one you're going to face the most. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you would like to sponsor a lecture, contact Karen. Her email is karen@atlchessclub.com. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. This was our closed Sicilian lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment if you're on YouTube, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.